Innovation is the motor of economic development and human progress. All we're doing is taking the basic science and applying it to food security. We're applying it to recreation. I'm always amazed the folks that I work with on the business side, how quick they are to build stuff.
Welcome to Unplucked, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association. This is the podcast where we strip away the fluff and get real about poultry science from bench to barn. I'm your host, Andy Vance, Executive Director of the Poultry Science Association. In this episode, we're going to talk with someone who wears a lot of different hats. One foot in academia, one foot in industry as a venture capitalist, an incubator, and, oh, by the way, a children's book author as well. We're going to talk with Dr. Maurice Pitesky, poultry epidemiologist, a veterinarian by training, who's also an extension educator, entrepreneur, and talk about the intersection specifically of hard science and the social sciences, from building tech that predicts avian influenza through his AgriNerds incubator and the Waterfowl Alert Network, to now writing a book to help kids bridge the gap between research and understanding how we raise chickens. Dr. Pitesky's deeply engaged in finding creative ways to communicate science. Professor, if you were going to explain the Waterfowl Alert Network to potential funder or collaborator, your elevator speech, if you will, would you describe the platform and its goals, what it's all about?
Yeah. So when you think about waterfowl, ducks and geese, and trying to understand where they are, just like we know what the weather is every day, we know it's going to rain or snow, and we have a sense of what's going to happen 2 to 3 days in advance. The Waterfowl Alert Network is basically a weather service for where waterfowl are. Now, why would you want to know where waterfowl are? If we're dealing with highly pathogenic avian influenza, waterfowl, like ducks and geese, are the main reservoir of the virus. If you're a waterfowl hunter, you might want to know, get a sense of what locations you might want to go to over the weekend for hunting, for example. If you are in renewables and you are thinking about where to put solar and wind power, understanding how that built environment affects waterfowl habitat, all important things. The really cool thing about the technology in my mind is that all we're doing is taking the basic science. So a colleague of mine at University of Delaware is a radar ornithologist. So we're taking his basic science, and he's part of AgriNerds, and we are applying it to food security. We're applying it to recreation. We're applying it to energy. And we're ultimately just leveraging the infrastructure that we have in the US, our weather radar, telemetry data, satellite imagery, all that type of data, which is already part of our kind of infrastructure when it comes to technology, is already there. We're just kind of rearranging the chairs. Instead of using that weather radar to detect if it's going to rain somewhere, we're using it to detect where waterfowl are, for example. There's a lot of potential applications. And the great thing to me about weather radar and telemetry is that those data exist throughout the entire planet. And what I'm really excited about is how we can scale this, not just to the US, but to Canada, to Europe, to Latin America. There's these amazing applications of radar that we haven't really leveraged, in addition to what we use weather radar for, which is obviously to remotely detect weather events all over the world.
I'm curious, how did all of these different pieces of your identity and your professional life come together? How did all of that become part of your CV and portfolio?
In part, it's personality. I'm probably the definition of the jack of all trades because I like trying different things. And I think it's always fun to be creative and try different things, at least see how you do, see how you like them. Part of it's being an extension. So if you're a professor, you really are focusing on one thing your entire career for the most part. And there's a little opportunity there for flexibility. If you're a professor of extension, by the nature of your job, you're really trying to work with industry partners and other stakeholders. And sometimes you have to expand and recalibrate and pivot to other problems. So I didn't start my career working on radar biology and high path AI, but that's become kind of one of my main focuses the last several years for all the reasons that I think we are all aware of with respect to avian influenza.
Necessity being the mother of invention, as they say. And it's fascinating how some of those external factors can shape a career in academia and research program, especially as extension. I think my experience with extension professionals is you're some of the most responsive scientists doing proper science. I always joke about us wacky social scientists in the disciplines I come from, but working for real hard bench scientists, I often find the intersection between the hard sciences and the soft sciences to be really intriguing. You're working with radar, telemetry, satellite data, machine learning, the way AI plays all in this real hard science. And yet I hear you talk a lot about these softer sciences, communication. And I'm curious as to how you think those work together and why the communication side of this is really important for scientists to think about as well.
First of all, I love that question in the sense that I'm 51, I'm in extension, and it's probably taken me till I was about 50 to really realize the value and utility of social science and how for extension, it's not just about going into a room and giving a talk and thinking that you've changed behavior, how you ultimately need good ways of measuring and good ways of nudging farmers and other stakeholders to do what we think is the right thing. And it's not as simple as doing the, as you say, the hard science and thinking everyone will adopt the technology. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And one of the great things about working in academia is that we get to work with all kinds of different types of scientists. So I've been working with social scientists at UC Davis on a variety of projects over the last several years. And it ultimately, especially in the world of social media, it's how do we kind of nudge people along to make good decisions when it comes to biosecurity, when it comes to disease prevention, when it comes to nutrition, vaccinating backyard animals, all those type of things are ultimately have a huge role to play as far as how we can nudge people to make those decisions. And that's kind of fundamental to extension, in my opinion.
Yeah, well said. As somebody who, a lot of my career, I always say I was a journalist who wanted to be an economist when I grew up. I love your use of the word nudge. Richard Thaler would prove, the behavioral economics of this. It was really important when we think about transfer of learning and so on in the extension space. So I'm going to ask you this one. What have you learned you said it took you till you were about 50 to start really thinking, what have you learned in terms of what not to do when trying to explain some of these complex scientific concepts to non-scientists in the roles that you occupy?
Yeah, so I think at a general level, I'm old enough to remember when serious scientists didn't use social media and it was considered almost uncouth to talk to reporters and to promote your work. That's changing. So I think one of the things not to do is to ignore the public. I'm an extension that would be kind of outside of my kind of nature of my job to ignore the public, but I still see people in extension and other academics that don't have websites, they don't have social media, they don't talk about their work in an accessible way. So I think the biggest thing I've learned is to try to engage with all kinds of folks across all types of different media. And I have a general rule. If someone reaches out to me and asks questions, whether it's just an email or whether it's an interview with podcast or a newspaper, I always try to help and at the minimum just suggest other folks that can be useful. But that's ultimately our job is not just to do the science, but to communicate it as best as we can to the general public.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, it's easy, I think, sometimes for those of us who are you're a gifted communicator. I've been doing this for 25 years, and maybe it's easy to just kind of downplay. Well, anybody can talk about this stuff if they put their mind to it, and it is hard. Sometimes the people who are maybe most drawn to the hard sciences aren't comfortable naturally. So I'm curious, as you have watched this evolve in the discipline and see more scientists understand that, hey, I do need to be on social media, or I do need to talk to reporters. This is an important part of my job. How does storytelling play a role in this idea of communicating science to non-scientists? Maybe especially in times of crisis like a high path AI outbreak or something where people need to know what to do and maybe get some measure of calm. How does that storytelling aspect of this play out?
So that's a really good question. So I think my instinct, I'm an epidemiologist and a veterinarian. So my instinct when people ask me a question is to try to answer what does the data say?
Show me the data.
Yeah, and that's important for folks like me because you don't want to cherry pick and you want to be able to give to my audiences and academic audiences, you want to be able to have some kind of grounding in what the consensus data suggests. That being said, we're human. And I recently heard the documentarian Ken Burns talking, and he was
Mm-hmm.
talking about how important storytelling is for
Yeah.
bridging and communication. And I've kind of taken that to heart over the years to realize that having a story is fundamental. And I've actually, especially when it comes to high path I do have a few really go-to ones that are anecdotal, but I think really to me show kind of where we are in our abilities and inabilities when it comes to biosecurity, for example. And I can throw all the data in the world, but I think having a story to tell farmers about something that I saw or something one of my graduate students observed, that's the kind of stuff, the way we're wired is the kind of stuff that we'll ultimately remember as far as, again, nudging people toward maybe trying new things and technologies, for example.
Yeah, it's an underrated skill maybe. Maybe it's starting to become more appreciated. I think about, like, we always laugh at history. Kids hate learning dates and the details and minutiae of battles, but why do we remember Gettysburg? Well, it's because there's great stories. Joshua Chamberlain in the 20th Maine. Why do you remember in War II General MacArthur? Because he said, "I shall return." People remember those stories more than they remember the facts and the figures and the data. Thinking about the scientists, researchers who are in the audience listening, and say, "All right, Professor, what advice do you have for me? I want to get involved, let's say, in either entrepreneurship, because your wealth of experience there, or communicating science. What's some advice you have for me as a researcher who's saying, I get it, but how do I do it?"
So, a couple answers I would think of. So, one is you should start getting, in my opinion, getting engaged in some type of social media, and just one. I'm not a social media savant. Fortunately, I have people in my lab who are really good and really gifted at that type of stuff. But trying to just pick one and start wading into that, because ultimately, if there is an outbreak of high path AI and you've been posting on whatever your favorite social media is and following it, at some point you're prepared then for some kind of scenario where you become an expert and people start reaching out to you, or your technology becomes interesting and valuable and practical. So I think on the science communication side, I think it's really important to be prepared. Chance favors the prepared mind. And on the entrepreneurship side, that's a slightly harder one just for me in the sense that that's probably not where my natural kind of abilities go to. And it's taken years for me to start becoming more comfortable in those type of audiences among those type of groups. It is so different than academia and research. And it's been, just to be perfectly honest, a challenge, but it's really interesting opportunity and challenge. And I think we're starting to see more academics going into entrepreneurship, but it's still seen at some level as kind of moving to the dark side, for lack of a better phrase. I still do have these feelings of guilt about it for some reason, but it's definitely a difference. Every time I talk to anyone about price, I know that's not everyone's favorite conversation, but that's definitely not in my wheelhouse. And we've been able to work with people that are much more sophisticated and thoughtful about those kind of topics over the years and get guidance from them. But that's been a hard thing for me, at least personally.
Well, and I think something you said earlier bears repeating. A lot of our universities in the modern world today, at least I would say in North America, have resources available now that maybe they didn't 20 years ago, tech transfer departments and so on. So there are maybe some resources on campus to help guide you or give you some places to start looking for more guidance or insights or information.
One thing I'll just point out really quickly. So our lab does some work in China, and it's interesting how they don't have extension over there for the most part, which is a problem. And that's for most of the world. They don't have extension. But one of the things the Chinese are actually really good at, to their credit at their universities, is they really try to create opportunities, entrepreneurship opportunities. And that's part of your merit and promotion is to be able to start a company. That's one of the factors that they evaluate on.
Yeah.
And that's so much different than here. So I think we'll get there, and I think we're maybe starting to bring on, we have all this infrastructure now, to your point, venture catalysts at universities, and there's a whole ecosystem of resources for us now.
Hmm.
But there are other models out there that really try to motivate academics to at least consider it. Basic research is basic research, and that's not as entrepreneurial by nature,
Sure.
and fundamental to getting to applied science, obviously. It takes a while to change behavior, but I think there are more and more people and more universities that are acknowledging that opportunity.
Well, and this is a good segue into something I'm curious about. I always like talking about collaboration, particularly between industry and academia, and maybe we'll loop in communication professionals into this as well. For you, looking down the pike, where do you see the greatest opportunity or opportunities for collaboration between those different groups of professionals in the academic, the industry, and or the communications world?
Yeah, I think there are opportunities, especially now because of all the changes that are happening to funding. And not to get too political, but there have been some significant cuts in NIH and USDA research. First of all, that innovation is the motor of economic development and human progress. So I think there are opportunities for universities, and you're starting to get to see this a little, for universities to start partnering with all different types of companies in order to kind of help nudge those type of relationships. It's going to take time, and there's a lot of challenges with respect to intellectual property, but I think there is a real opportunity. One of the superpowers of our country and our societies, we are a very creative, entrepreneurial society. So we should be taking these amazing universities with all these great ideas and creating opportunities for that entrepreneurial kind of personality and attitude. And I think there's real opportunities there. I hope ultimately that it's a partnership between government and academia and entrepreneurs, because I think there's just so much potential there. I mean, we have so many resources here that we should be leveraging.
Well, and I think your example with AgriNerds and the Waterfowl Alert Network, a great example, just even within the lens of academia, the opportunity for interdisciplinary work. You've got a pretty great example there of we need to understand epidemiology and some of the biological things going on here and the availability of sensors and technologies and more engineering kind of things, and then putting that all together and how do we manage the data, it's the computer science of it. And then, of course, taking it on the industry side, how do we commercialize and scale this? Well, I wonder if you might pick that apart a little bit, like how all of those different disciplines had to come together for you to really be able to launch this particular platform and product.
I think it, like a lot of these things, it kind of happens by just the randomness of life and opportunities. When I started my academic career, I didn't even think about that kind of entrepreneurial kind of opportunity. I think most of us, we go into science for all kinds of altruistic reasons, and we don't always think about what those opportunities are in a real world kind of situation. I think a lot of it is the opportunity to work with other people. So I'm a veterinarian and epidemiologist,
Mhm.
but I ultimately, when you look at my lab has engineers in it, it's got computer scientists in it, it's got waterfowl biologists in it, it's got epidemiologists, and it's got some veterinarians in it. That to me is the secret sauce of what a university and what a national lab, for example, brings to the equation. Now I'm working with companies that are business minded, but have engineering skills, and ultimately, their superpower is their ability to scale and take an idea and quickly turn it into something that's easy for consumers to utilize and buy. I'm always amazed the folks that I work with on the business side, how quick they are to build stuff. Where in the academic world, we are very slow and we argue all the time, and we ultimately don't always get as much done. It's a little more thoughtful what we're doing in some ways, but having that kind of broad-based team, with different skills, different motivations, has been, to me, the secret sauce of how you can slowly but surely make progress on these kind of opportunities.
I get a kick out of you talking about the pace of academia. I once had a colleague describe it, said academia moves at about half the speed of smell, and I thought that was a pretty good descriptor. But there is something to be said for that thoughtful, deliberative approach, right, to a lot of the big problems that we deal with. And then that industry side, sometimes we could say move fast, break things. So there's
Yeah.
some good opportunity for happy mediums there. And as we finish up our time together, Professor, I was thinking back to when you were talking about your lab, different kinds of scientists and other professionals, maybe people like me who wouldn't consider themselves a scientist, but have a role to play in the kind of work you're describing. What can, whether it's PIs or institutions, organizations that are listening, do to encourage and train more people who can work in those interdisciplinary teams to translate contextualize and share some of this important research and the important science out there. You've made a really compelling case. What do we do to encourage more of those kinds of professionals and get them plugged into teams like yours?
Yeah, so more cross training. So one of the problems I find just in my kind of day to day is that sometimes we have a bunch of veterinarians talking to a bunch of veterinarians, and ultimately we don't have enough engineers, computer scientists, social scientists, historians who are really kind of diving into whatever problem we're dealing with. Part of that is the way that we teach. We don't always encourage, in my opinion, enough cross training. The national labs are really, really good at that, actually. So if you go to Lawrence Livermore National Lab, Los Alamos National Lab, people aren't stratified by their background. They're actually grouped together as a team. And that creates, just by the nature of that system, that creates much more kind of cross pollination. Right now, if I want to go over to computer science, I have to go to a separate building on the other side of campus. That doesn't really encourage that kind of cross training. So to your point, I would encourage students and grown-ups. I think cross training is really fundamental and kind of thinking about problems from a broader perspective. I'm kind of a history nut. So whenever I look at high path AI, I kind of look at it in part through the lens of like, well, have we ever had anything like this in the last 7,000 years of domesticated farm animals? And the answer is no. And that just gives you that perspective that we're dealing with something really unique that is very challenging to deal with. And we just need, ultimately, these are the kinds of problems that need that kind of cross-disciplinary approach across all the sciences. So I always tell students and remind myself to try to keep kind of pushing out in different directions. The whole reason I got into radar biology is because I randomly came across a paper, among other things, that was talking about how to use radar to look at where waterfowl are. And then you start connecting the dots from there. And I think that's one of the things we want to ultimately encourage people to do, is to start cross-training more, hopefully.
Yeah, leaders are readers. I always go back to that. So I love that your story in this aspect of it starts with reading a journal article. Last question. I want to end with a fun note. I understand you just wrote a children's book. I'd love to know about it. Tell us about the kids' book.
Yeah, so I'm one of the co-authors, along with a colleague and veterinarian friend of mine, Dr. Evan Adler, and we have an amazingly gifted graphic designer. Long story short, it's actually children all the way to adults book if you like sophisticated dad senses of humor.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of backyard chicken books out there, and what we came up with is a slightly different kind of take on it, in the sense that everything in the book is peer reviewed, but it's written in kind of a fun, silly manner. And we have all kinds of different characters, including Dr. Cluck, who kind of tries to kind of guide the characters to do the right thing. But we have all these characters that are hopefully telling this kind of cartoonish like story related to biosecurity and food safety and raising chicks and nutrition and all the different topics that are fundamental to raising a happy and healthy flock. So that the book should be out in the next month or two. And it's taken over 10 years to write. So I always joke with people that it took Lin-Manuel Miranda about 8 years to write Hamilton. So this is definitely not Hamilton, but I do respect how long it takes to kind of not only start these kind of projects, but finish them. And I'm super excited to have a book that I've been part of.
Can't wait to read it. Sounds like a fun project, a labor of love. Look forward on our shelves before too long. Professor, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Great. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor Maurice Pitesky from UC Davis, Agri-Nerds, and the Waterfowl Alert Network for joining us. If you want to learn more about Agri-Nerds, you can visit their website, agrinerds.com. And if you're curious about the Waterfowl Alert Network, go to waterfowl.info, and you can see an example of the kind of reports that Dr. Pitesky talked about. Really fascinating technology. I would encourage you to go look into those and explore further, and keep a lookout for the book as well. Subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. If you feel so inclined, give us a rating as well. It helps folks find us if they're out there looking for intriguing scientific content. This is, of course, a weekly episode. If you've got a suggestion for a future topic, we'd love to hear about it. Visit our website, poultryscience.org today. Submit your idea and, of course, go back and listen to any episodes you might have missed. This episode of Unplucked was produced by Lindsay Johnston with editing and engineering by Michael Lunt of Parasol. That's going to do it for this week's episode. For the Poultry Science Association, I'm Andy Vance. See you next week.